Okay. I hope you all had a great lunch break. It is my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker of the afternoon session here. Dave Crossland is a Reading grad, and even before he went to Reading, he became a lifelong fan of Libre fonts, which has led him into a lot of really interesting areas. For quite a while now, it has, this is recording? Okay, for quite a while now, it has led him to be working closely with the Google Fonts team and many other projects as well, but Google Fonts seems to have been the primary focus for, about 10 years now. And he's going to tell us a little bit about some of the process that has dragged him into here as Google continues to add fonts with new kinds of variable axes, which is an interesting challenge. So I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Axis registration process with Google Fonts, and the the Google Fonts service is offering more and more variable fonts every year, and so I'm just going to take you through a few of the places where you can learn about some of these new releases. So hopefully the technology is going to work here, and I want to. There we go. Okay, so here's Google Fonts today, fonts.google.com, and over on the little right-hand side here, you've got a little sorting thing, which by default is on trending, and we actually have a little option here to see the newest fonts. So if you sort by newest, you will see the newest stuff at the top, and that is a great place to see what's new. And of course, then there's a little show only variable fonts checkbox, which will only show you the variable fonts. We also have the Google Fonts GitHub repository, and if you go in there, you'll get a sneak peek of what's coming down the pipeline. And we, after publishing fonts, have our blog, which is where we post some more in-depth content, and then there's the design.google website, which is the Google design team, where they publish lots of different articles about design happening at Google. But there's a typography section, and we've got some very nicely illustrated and in-depth articles, which is a bit more of a kind of magazine kind of content as opposed to more that blog kind of content. And so we've been announcing, some interesting releases there. And then we also have some mini sites. So we've got a website which is all about the Roboto serif typeface. And this is, a custom website where we, have a very rich, wonderful graphic design specific to that typeface, where you can go in and explore the typeface family, see all of the different, styles and weights and widths and all the good things in these fonts. So that's Roboto serif. Another very recent release is coming up with the Tilt fonts, a set of 3 typefaces by master designer Andy Clymer. And these Tilt fonts are quite wonderful variable fonts. They have just 2 axes, and they tilt the designs in the X dimension and the Y dimension. And so you'll see that here. If I mouse over here, you can see that you can tilt in the X dimension, tilt in the Y dimension, and then obviously it's been hooked up to the mouse pointer, so you can get this very nice sort of animation or interactive quality. And so the 3 typefaces have these 3 different kinds of kind of 3D structures. So we've got this sort of Toblerone chocolate kind of thing going on here. Then we've got the kind of vinyl sticker peel. You know, you can sometimes see that old kind of lettering peeling away in the sun. And then we've got let's see. So we got the sticker one, and I went past it. Let's get back to the neon one. So then you've got your kind of neon signage. And so, you know, Andy used to be in New York for many years, and these are the kinds of, you know, this is the kind of type you see around the city. And he was walking down the street one day, and he kind of noticed how walking past, you know, a neon sign, you know, you see it in these different ways, and he sent a little joke to his friend, "Can your variable font do this?" And then he thought, maybe I can do that. So that was great. And then upcoming release is Kablamo. This is a sneak peek for you. This has not really been shown before. And this just has one axis, which loops around and sort of morphs the design. So let's go back to the slide deck here. So these mini sites have been published on fonts.withgoogle.com. And over this, you know, years of publishing these fonts, we have been updating and improving our process. And so we have initially invested in some tools to kind of automate what we're doing. But we've found that even though we've moved from things being very kind of messy and you know, just a few individuals like myself doing it with not a lot of documentation or tooling around it, as we've built up those tools, we've ended up returning back to documentation to then explain how to use those tools. And so we have this contribution guide now, and I especially want to thank Viviana Monsalve and Rosalie Wagner for really leading the effort on this. And so this guide is very comprehensive to how to add fonts into Google Fonts if you were, you know, wanting to submit something. And so a key piece of that onboarding process is the idea of registering axes in the Google Fonts system. And so again, I'm going to switch forward to some. So this is the guide. Lots of information here about all kinds of things you need to know. And so when we add a font to the Google Fonts system, we have this API, and we have this variable fonts page, which has this list of all of the variable font families and all of their axes tags here, and their default min, max values, and also the step, how precise you can request a particular range in the Fonts API. And then at the bottom of the page, there's the axis definitions list. And so these are the axes which are defined in the Google Fonts system. And they have a little description, and they have the sort of library-wide values for those default minimum, maximum values. So the way that data gets into the system is through GitHub. And we have this github.com/googlefonts/axis registry repo. And you can see there's some issues here where we're discussing the upcoming axes. And then if you dive into the data, this is set up as a Python package. And so if you drill down into that data directory, then you see we've got these descriptions. And so you can see, here's that structured data. And we also have some little illustrations to go with each of these axes. And I'll cover that shortly. So in the Microsoft OpenType specification, there's the sort of official OpenType spec, OpenType layout tag registry. Wait, that's not the right one, is it? That's the layout registry. We want the design variations registry. There we go. And so we've got these axes here. There's 5 of them, which were introduced in 2016. And they also have, this sort of definition information, minimum and maximum values, and more additional information. And back at that time, 2016, 2017, there was this GitHub repository which was set up to discuss, future proposals. There's some really good documentation in here to explain, what an axis, is all about, why it's important to have in the OpenType specification, these definitions of axes. And there were some very good proposals made. There were lots of discussions, but for various reasons, this axis registration process has not yet continued in the font format. So, in a sense, the need to have a registry is ideal when it's in the font format specification. Everyone working with that font format data, can go to that place and know what these axes are being defined as. Nevertheless, the idea of custom axes, all the other axes which are not in the font specification, are really open to the type designer. And in the Google font system, we've had to find a kind of middle place between those two things. So in the fonts API, you have this documentation page here, and this is the classic quick start guide. It's very quick and simple. You request your family in the code, and it shows up on the page. And then to access a variable font, you specify in your API request your axes values, and these are per family in the API there. But in order to have the library work in a sort of predictable way, then we really want to see the same axes that are used across different font families working the same way. So it gives the user that sort of ability to use one font family, see how that works, and sort of transfer that knowledge on to using other font families. So let's see here. So the Axis Registry protocol is this piece of the Google Fonts guide that we've developed so that when people are submitting fonts, they can understand the way that the Google Fonts team is thinking about the axes that are being added to the Google Fonts system. And so we have this sort of protocol that we've called it, a sort of back and forth discussion between the type designer and the Google Fonts team. The sort of first thing is to look at these, these existing axes are already in the system, and what is being in this proposed typeface, and see if it would make sense to reuse one of those existing axes and maybe change the font to fit, the existing library. Sometimes the type designers aren't always happy about this because their font is already using their axis, and that's what they want. And they say, why would I, chop off a feet of my font, to make it fit into this crustacean bed? But we think that this is a good thing for the end user, that you get that knowledge transfer. And so, on the other hand, we can also modify the axis definitions. So, for example, if the axis, is specified to be a certain range, and that font has a bigger range, then we can update the range, and expand it. And indeed, if the font is introducing something that's really novel and new to the library, and we don't have an axis for anything like that, we add the new axis. And so we have some philosophy ideas about what the different axes can mean. So in the font format, the ranges can be any numbers, but some numbers have already some meaning. So 0 to 1 is kind of like a binary or a Boolean kind of value on and off. 0 to 100 means like a percent. People are familiar with dealing with what 50 out of 100 means. And even though 500 out of 1,000 is really the same thing, it's just mentally easier to deal with 50 instead of 500. And maybe if you have 50.5, you know exactly what that means. 505, you just have to think about it a little bit more. So these kinds of cultural values about the number values is something which we are, thinking about with regard to that end user experience. And so this is the kind of thing which, is maybe something, which could go into the font format, but maybe isn't something that is so much about the technology. So we have, been into this. We're talking about, with the ranges, the idea of continuous ranges, which can be relative or absolute, which is to say that, a relative axis, you start off with a default value, typically say 0, and you're moving the design relative to that. And we've also introduced absolute values, or ranges, which correspond to some measurement in the font. So you could imagine you have your font UPM, you have your baseline, you have some value that's moving something above or below relative to the baseline, and it can measure that in, could be UPM units, and David Berlow has suggested per mil of M values, so that whatever the UPM is, you normalize that to 1,000, and then that per mil value is a classic value of typography, the per mil of M value. So these can be, different values appropriate for different situations, and we've got this nice long guide to try and explain all the ins and outs of this, and then, to go through the whole process. We've got some nice links at the bottom, lots of reading to do. So a couple of examples. So grade is an axis which was discussed back in 2015, 2016 as the variable fonts standard was originally being developed. And it didn't quite make it in. So there's 5 axes in the font format at the moment. And this was very close. It was being discussed, didn't quite make it in. And so one of the first variable fonts which Google Fonts commissioned from the Font Bureau was Amstel var. And it has this weight axis, you can see here. Let me click here, on axis praxis. And you can see as I reduce the weight here, then the character widths are changing in proportion with the weight. And you can see it's going from 2 to 3 lines. As the weight increases, the widths increase. And so David and the Font Bureau team, before variable fonts, had issued typefaces with sets of grades. And so the way that the grade differs from weight is you can see here, I've got this 2-line subtitle here. It's very close to being on 3 lines. And if I want to increase the weight further, it's knocking it down, it's knocking it onto 3 lines in that way. So with the grade axis here, you can see you can increase the weight, and there's no reflow. So it's a more restricted range of stroke weights in the letters, but it's not changing the line layout at all. And I think there's lots of useful things to do with this. For example, on interaction, hovering on something like a button, you might want to see it interact, but not change what the layout is of the dialogue of the page. So that's it. And if we zoom in on this is how easy this is going to work. But you can see the values here initially in this very first release of Amstel var were trying to use that per mil of M value to give you some precise value of what was happening with the grade. Subsequent to Amstel var's release, other people have also released grade fonts. Eric Van Blokland with Lettera have released some good ones, and this one I was happy to see from, I believe, a French designer. Here we are in Paris. And it's a nice family here, and you can see there's just one axis grade, and its values are 0 to 10. And so you can apply the grade here, and let's see, it's very subtle, but there is, especially if you look like down on the italic at the highest contrast parts of the stroke, like on this A here, you can see as I'm moving that to max, that stroke contrast is being reduced, you know. And this is actually really the kind of origin of the grade axis in print media, that the word grade is kind of a strange word. What does that mean? Well, the idea at Font Bureau was that they had produced typefaces for a magazine, and the magazine, this is back in the 90s, had some pages printed in color and some printed with black ink on white paper. And they had different printing presses for the different papers, and the same digital font used on the two different printing presses, the ink would bleed slightly differently into the different kind of paper stock, and the same font would actually look quite different. So they developed a range of weight variations with no reflow, so that the graphic designers could substitute the different grades without having to change any layout, and they could get, through print tests, the same font weight, the same stroke weights on the papers that were different. So you could have a spread, that where one side of it is in color, one side is black and white, and the text is feeling even. And so that's this very kind of subtle adjustment in the digital outlines, and that was the origin of it. And because it was about this ink in the press, the ink in the press is kind of oil, and you have grades of oil to describe the viscosity of the oil, and so that's where that name comes from. So very subtle here, and so being so subtle, it makes sense to have 10 units. But in the previous example, hello. Oops, wait, that's not right. There we go. In the previous example, we were using these per mil of M units, hundreds of units to make a similar kind of adjustment. And then for me, this became a bit of a vexing problem. Lots of people making grade, lots of different values, and often people are making things across different operating systems. And Apple have released a version of San Francisco Pro that also has a grade axis, and they curiously have a weight axis here, so you'll see that reflow of different lines here, and it's using the open type specification weight range value from 1 to 1000. And this is something of a relative axis. Your regular is your 400 weight. What is a weight 1? What does it look like? It's up to the typeface. There's no absolute measurement going on here. And so the grade also is given a unit value from 400 to 1000, and here you can increase the grade. And so you can have weight 1000, grade 1000. Having the grade related to the weight values, I think, is a good idea. However, those grade values are, in a sense, sort of absolute. They're not relative to the weight values. So let's see. We had some reevaluation of this. We saw that Apple decision, and I discussed it with David and Font Bureau folks, and it was a good idea to relate the grade values to the weight values. And so we had a little discussion about this as we came up to releasing Roboto Serif. His mark in the chat there, and we had a good discussion with John, and David and I, sort of went to explain, what we were thinking, what does this mean, and eventually that made more sense. So that was good. And so we then went back to commercial type and have released Roboto Serif. It's here today on Google Fonts. If you drill down into the specimen page, there's a little type tester you can access, and you can see the grades have this sort of relative value. So you can see the grade starts at 0, goes up to 100, down to -50. And the idea is that if you set your grade to 100, let's do that, and then you have your weight at 400, then your stroke weights here should be very similar to if you were just at weight 500. So you can interrelate these two axes, and yeah. So that's there it is in Roboto Serif. Obviously, we also use those values in Roboto Flex. In the Google Fonts type tester kind of playground area here, you can see we've got a little information round icon here, and then that gives you that little summary of the axis to explain more about it. And then that Learn More link is going to take you to a big new piece of the Google Fonts website, which is Google Fonts Knowledge. And yeah, if you haven't seen that, that's a big compendium of knowledge about typography. This has been led sort of editorially by Elliot J. Stocks, and we've got lots of topics, and one of them, of course, is about variable fonts. And what we have sort of seen is that as we introduce these more advanced, more capable typefaces, then they're offering advanced functionality. But if users don't understand the the more nuanced, advanced ideas in typography, they won't be able to take advantage and use the these large typefaces that are on offer. So we're trying to help users, with these knowledge articles so that they can learn a bit more about how to make use of the fonts available. And so as part of this, we have these axes definitions, which go into a bit more detail. So the axis registry GitHub data is, sort of more structured, functional data. And in the Google Fonts Knowledge website, we've got more of, in-depth explanation with some sort of tips and tricks, where we explain, how you could use these axes and that kind of thing. Okay, so other, font providers have generally, as I've seen, not published their set of axes definitions, their axis registries. And obviously you have the classic kind of web font generator from Font Squirrel, where you download your font, and it comes in a little zip file. It's a self-contained piece, and it's not really connected to the wider library that's available from Font Squirrel. And Adobe Fonts also have done a fantastic job of releasing hundreds of variable fonts. And I'm very happy they've got this wonderful UI for interacting with the variations on a canvas. So you see here, you've got this kind of dial thing here. You've got this little handle over here. And yeah, I think that this kind of interaction model is really fantastic. Instead of sliders off at the side, you're directly interacting with the type. This is good stuff. And so I was just browsing the site, and I came across this wonderful display typeface, and it's got these wonderful custom axes: verticals, thrust, lift, horizontals, lots of fun things. However, when looking at this, when I use this axis, to me, this seems to be a kind of width axis. So this is the kind of thing, when someone is contributing a typeface to Google Fonts, we're thinking about, could this be reusing an existing axis definition? And sometimes it can get, nuanced. So another great typeface I saw in Adobe Fonts, and it has a classic width axis. So it starts at 100%, sort of relative value, and it goes up to 250, quite wide. But it also has, in addition to the width axis, a stretching axis, which has this nice percent-based, 1 to 100 kind of range. Let's see, let's maybe make that a bit smaller. And so this is this is a fun display typeface, and the stretching axis is only affecting some of the glyphs and stretching them out, whereas the width axis, you can see, is affecting all of them in a more subtle way. So that's a bit of a conundrum. You've got this designer who's made this typeface. They've got these two axes. They do slightly different things. Could we say the stretching axis should just be part of the width axis? Maybe not. So these questions, how to structure the axes, how to relate them, can be, subtle. There's lots of things going on there. And on v-fonts.com, a wonderful website by Nick Sherman, he has a long list of lots of variable fonts that are available. And this other typeface, published by Dalton Marg, also has this same kind of thing, where you've got a width axis. Here it is. You've got the width axis, and you've got a mixed axis, which also makes some of the letters wider than others. And so seeing two typefaces with this kind of special width axis would lead me to think that, yeah, there's probably something here. This is probably something there's going to be lots of typefaces, that might want to do this, and this is a kind of candidate for registration. So if you have a typeface that you're not suggesting to publish in Google Fonts, but you think that it would be good for other people to see that access, to use that access in their own projects, I do encourage you to post an issue on the Access Registry Google Fonts GitHub so that we can consider it, talk about it, and see if we can encourage more people to reuse that access. And that ultimately, the end users, the graphic designers, the typographers are going to get that knowledge transfer, that they start using one font, they understand how it works, and then the next time they see another font with that same access name, that same kind of access range of values, they know how to use it.
All right, we do have some time for questions, and if you want to ask a question, use the mic.
Thanks, Dave. This is great progress to see. So for those that don't know, Dave showed the on Microsoft's site, OpenType Access Registry and a GitHub project, and this was something that I set up in early 2017 with the hope of having something, a result similar to what what the Google Font folk are realizing now, getting people engaged in suggesting what is an axis that could be widely useful across the industry, and how do we come up with a consensus of what those axes are and what the numbers should mean, right? So one question I'd have for, my attempt didn't succeed in part, I think, because it was just too early and not enough people were really engaged with it. Whereas you guys have invested in a lot of variable fonts, which would bring that result. How have you thought about how to engage the broader industry community to, for instance, taking grade as a good example, right? You decided to come up with a definition, making it relative, and I think what you described sounds like a very sensible way of doing it. But how do you make sure that you've got the broad industry on board with the definition that comes out?
Well, I think that's why I'm presenting this today. I think that the nature of the format has that freedom in it, right? That people can put whatever axes, whatever values they want in their typeface, and any publisher of more than one typeface, of more than one variable font, is by definition developing their own kind of axis registry, right? It might have contradictions in it, but they have their set of axes and their set of values just implicitly in what they're publishing. And so I think that even if people are not, conforming to the axis definitions that Google Fonts are using, at least they will start to think more about that library scale. I think that's kind of, for me, one of the key aims to see outside of what Google Fonts is doing itself. I think in those early days, there weren't that many people making variable fonts. There was a small group who were very passionate about it and put out quite a lot of variable fonts. We're seeing more and more foundries moving towards kind of variable fonts as a default. And so, I think that, seeing other larger publishers also, being able to extract that data from their library and turn that into their axis, definition, sort of database, it would be a great thing. In terms of sort of fragmentation, that's definitely a challenge. Like the Apple system fonts have a grade axis that works differently to the Android system fonts grade axis. So I think there's definitely, been some missed opportunities in the past. No blame, but at least I could take it. For not getting more active on this, sooner. And there's definitely been some situations that within Google Fonts where we've, added a typeface into the library, we've registered its axes, and then later we thought, oh, maybe we could have defined that in actually a better way. So that axis registry protocol document is, definitely, an important one, and encourage people to definitely check that out.
The 5 axes that are registered in the OpenType variations registry as part of the format, they were kind of obvious because they addressed in a variable space functionality that already exists in the software. So bolder, wider, narrower, size, slant, and italics were all things that were already well understood and already implemented in software. We just needed a way to implement them within a variable design space. I think part of the reasons why we didn't get a lot of other things added was that there was no idea what the interaction was going to be with software, because we still don't know what the interaction with software is be. So we can make all sorts of variable fonts with all sorts of custom axes, and there is some sense in reusing the same tags, reusing the same scales and stuff, just in terms of something like kind of user predictions of what a thing's going to do. But we still don't have that interaction between the variable axes and functionality in software or in browsers or in kind of the way that which variable fonts are used. So I wonder, kind of, are you at Google Fonts also looking at this from the other side in terms of what could you do, whether in CSS extensions or something, to actually plug into the new variations axes that you're registering?
So I would say that the Google Fonts Axis Registry is a bit of a cheeky name, because obviously the official OpenType specification has its Axis Registry, which I think, as I as I tripped over myself there, there was the layout tag registry that preceded it, and so I think that the software application developers or browser web standard specifications, I expect would be looking to the font format standards rather than to a private company who have a private a sort of a public published yet private registry, in a sense, right? That this is the Google Fonts registry. And while it's being made public, and I would encourage everyone, to make their fonts compatible with those axes, since their customers, their users, would come across other fonts in Google Fonts, probably using these axes, and get that, mental model transfer. And there's nothing proprietary about, this axis definition. I'm not sure, that it would make sense for Mozilla to depend on the Google Fonts registry data. I would be very happy to see the font format development grow that font format axis registry definitions and be a independent industry standard. That's definitely kind of boring expansion of the format. We're just doing what's already been done, continuing it on.
Yeah, but my question is really about, are we coming at it from the right side, coming at it from the font format and the registration, rather than coming at it from the typography software side, to drive what happens in the fonts from functionality to the software?
Yeah, I mean, I think that use cases is very important, and that is something which the mini sites that we've been doing can play a role in. Where you see the Google font being used on a web page that is totally custom, and typically there's a GitHub source, the website source is available and so on. So I think that there's definitely a lot of opportunity to do that kind of engagement with design authoring applications and you know, the web standards folks. Their inputs will be very, very valuable. But that is probably something I personally, I don't know about driving. You know, we're, in a sense, you know, Google Fonts is not Google typography. It's making fonts for other people to do typography with, and that's always been a bit of an issue. You know, with a you know, a relatively modest team and modest resources, you have to focus what you're doing, and so yeah, especially for, you know, the Font Bureau parametric axes system. I believe there's a lot of potential to improve quality typography by having that access to the low-level sort of parameters of the typeface. And yet you have to have quite a deep typographic education to see those kinds of possibilities. And, you know, I've obviously got like a master's degree in typeface design, and most people don't have that. They haven't spent 2 years just focusing on fonts, like an idiot. So, yeah, I agree. Use cases continues to be very important. All right, I think we probably need to wrap it up and head on to the next one. So thank you for coming.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. We've got to switch to our next speaker.